Hi, everyone. Welcome to 3GNY Stories Live, WEDU Wednesday. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Dave Wags, 3GNY board member and former president. I'm also the grandson of two Holocaust survivors. This is our 31st WEDU Wednesday, our virtual series that brings our education initiative, WEDU, from classrooms to your rooms. We are so glad to have you here for this special WEDU Wednesday program, and we look forward to having you join us for more in the future. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit for grandchildren of survivors and supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. We empower 3Gs to share their stories. For tonight's event, we'll be featuring 3GNY speaker and currently our interim education and outreach coordinator, Wendy Tepper, who will share the story of her grandfather, Oscar Cukierman. Tonight's program showcases 3GNY's flagship educational initiative, WEDU, which is short for We Educate. WEDU empowers grandchildren of survivors to compellingly share their family's Holocaust experiences in school classrooms and with community groups. Studies have shown that students who receive Holocaust education are more tolerant and comfortable with people of different races and backgrounds. They're more willing to challenge incorrect or biased information and are more likely to be upstanders. Through our grandparents' stories, we provide a human face to the past and a living link to the present, inspiring our listeners to stand up to hatred and to act with courage and compassion. 3GNY has trained more than 500 speakers in New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, and around the country. We've shared our stories in more than 1,500 classrooms and have impacted more than 60,000 students and community members. And between our live programming and YouTube channel, more than 18,000 additional people have heard our stories. In celebration of 3GNY's 18th or Chai anniversary, and in honor of our grandparents who inspired us, we've launched our Chai campaign to ensure 3GNY maximizes its impact today and is poised to continue doing so tomorrow. We're at a pivotal moment. We've been out in full force in schools, educating young minds by sharing our family stories of survival and resilience, but we need to do more. We're witnessing anti-Semitism at record highs, and our work has assumed greater urgency. Now, more than ever, we need your help to meet the moment and ensure we're countering anti-Semitism with education as much as possible. We also must continue to nurture, sustain, and grow our incredible 3G community, thousands of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who found a home with 3GNY and understand the immense responsibility that comes with this family history. Please make a gift to 3GNY's Chai campaign today. You can easily do so with the link in the chat and help us stand up to hate through our love for our grandparents. We promised our grandparents that we'll make sure their memory and stories continue to live on. Your support will help us keep that promise. Thank you for believing in 3GNY's mission. It is now my distinct honor to introduce Amy Goodman, one of our fantastic volunteer speakers, to introduce Wendy and tonight's program.
Thank you, Dave. Hi, everyone. I'm Amy Goodman. I am the oldest granddaughter of 4 Holocaust survivors, and I had the great privilege of hearing their stories firsthand for the first 30 years of my life. After they passed away, I knew it was up to me to share their stories, and that's why I became involved with WEDU. And I did the training to learn how to share my grandparents' stories in January of 2023. I live in Monmouth County, New Jersey, with my husband, Dan, and we have 3 sons who are 17, 20, and 22. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Wendy Tepper. After communicating a few times regarding WEDU speaking engagements, Wendy and I realized that we both live in the same town about 5 minutes from each other. It really is a very small world. Wendy Tepper is the granddaughter of Holocaust survivor Oscar Cukierman. Growing up as a 3G deeply influenced Wendy's decision to pursue a Bachelor of Arts in elementary education at Penn State University. Inspired by her heritage, she dedicated herself to teaching students the values of kindness, advocacy, and celebrating diversity. With 12 years of experience in the classroom, she has developed a strong foundation in education, which has prepared her for her current role as Interim Education and Outreach Coordinator for 3GNY. Outside of her work with 3GNY, Wendy enjoys baking, spending time with her husband Craig and two sons, Jake and Max, and being a dog mom to Teddy. While Wendy is sharing, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A feature in the Zoom menu. We will have plenty of time for questions and discussion after Wendy's story. Wendy, take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy. I wanted to start off by saying thank you so much to all of my family, my friends, and anyone from the 3GNY community who came to bear witness tonight. As I sit here tonight, it is not lost on me that myself, along with the many 2Gs and 3Gs attending, were all real miracles. Any descendant of a Holocaust survivor is living proof that the Jewish people are resilient and will continue to be proud and strong. Sharing these stories ensures the phrase never again. My grandpa Oscar was the most incredible and special person, and after hearing his story of resilience, I truly hope it inspires you and might change your life. I'm going to share his story as I would share it to students so that you can experience the incredible power of a 3G presentation. And now I have the honor of telling my grandfather's story, 5 camps, 1 survivor, Oscar Cukierman's story of resilience. And as I share my screen, I'm going to be showing you pictures of my family. So let's just make sure it's shared. Okay, great. So what I'd like you to do is I would like you to drop in the chat just what you see in these photos. And I do this with the students to kind of get them into the world of my grandfather and just kind of, ask them what they notice. So if you could look at the photos on the screen, I'd like you to drop in the chat, what do you see? So we're going to take a few minutes to just kind of discuss and again, share what you see in the pictures on your screen. Okay. Family, fun, joy, generational love, hats, yes. A happy family, pride, happiness. Thank you. Oh my gosh, so many good guys who loves hats, yes. America, family. All right, so we're gonna keep it rolling, a close-knit family. We are Penn State, good, yay, Penn State are in the audience, awesome. Character. And as these responses are rolling in, I'm kind of noticing a pattern of just family and closeness and love. And that's what our family really represented. We were a very close-knit family. Something that I wanted to mention was that my grandfather and my grandmother actually lived in our house growing up. So we were very close. I got grandma's cooking every night. I was really lucky. And every night I would sit with my grandfather and we would watch Jeopardy together and he would know all the answers to the questions. And if I asked my grandpa, like, I want to skip Hebrew school today and go to Starbucks instead, he was totally fine with it because he considered my sister and I and my cousin Matthew and Brooke, they're his princesses and princes. So, but I did notice growing up that my grandfather was a little different. Some things that I noticed about him was that he spoke 10 languages, which was obviously really interesting and cool. And I would ask him, how did you know 10 languages? And he would say, I lived a long life. Like he would just, and he would try to get me to sit down and learn the languages. And sometimes I would, but I never really appreciated it till I got older. Something else I noticed about my grandfather that was different was that he would never let us waste food. So if, for example, we had a chicken nuggets from a Happy Meal and I had 1 chicken nugget left, instead of throwing it out, my grandfather made us save it in the fridge. And so we never were allowed to waste food. If you opened his pantry, you would see sardines from like 1975, but we weren't allowed to touch it. And so between those two things, I noticed he was different, but I didn't really think anything of it. And something else that was different about my grandfather was that he never let us buy anything from Germany. And when I was 16, I got a Mazda, and he was totally fine with it, really proud that I got a new car. And then my sister, 2 years later, got a Volkswagen. And for those of you who are not very, well-versed on cars, Volkswagens are made in Germany. So my grandpa actually didn't speak to my sister for about 2 months. That's a true story. And so with all these things combined, I knew he was different. And when I got to be about middle school age, we started learning about the Holocaust. And I came home and I asked my dad, is grandpa or grandma a Holocaust survivor? And when my dad shared with me that my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, I was shocked. The reason I was shocked was because he's just, as you see on screen, the most happy. I mean, I could describe him as just delicious. He's like the sweetest man. And anybody who knew him in the audience can tell you the same. And it was just shocking to me that he had gone through so much. And when I asked my dad his story, my dad said, I know parts of it, but I don't know the whole thing. He doesn't really like talking about it. So fast forward to when he was about 87 years old, I asked him to sit down with me and record the entire thing on film, and he agreed. So at the age of 87, with me, my Aunt Cheryl, and my Uncle Ron, who are in the audience tonight, and my husband, Craig, even though he wasn't my husband yet, we sat down and filmed him. And for over an hour, he shared every detail of his resilience and tragic losses. And that entire video is on the United States Holocaust Museum's website. And I would tell you, other than maybe having my children, and they're the greatest joys of my life, one of my proudest moments was being able to hear his entire story. And it is my honor to share with you tonight. So my grandfather grew up in a town called Bendzin, Poland, in the south of Poland in 1925. As you can see from the map, the town he was born in was not far from the German border. He described it as less than 10 miles away. And so, he grew up basically in a normal town, and, knew people from Germany, and it was a very peaceful town. He said that, there was rarely any anti-Semitism. Here and there was a little bit, but it was taken care of very quickly. And he grew up in a very loving household. His father was Mendel and his mother was Sirla. And his name growing up was Usher. And I share that because that's an important detail for later in the story. And I'd like you to know him as a child as well. So as a child, his name was Usher, and his three brothers were Mutik, Wolf, and Shia. So there were 4 boys. So I'm sure if any of you in the audience tonight have sons or have a brother, just imagine there being 4 boys in the house. It was really like a fun house. They were very close. My grandpa told me that he used to play soccer with his brothers in the street, and they would stay out past curfew. And it was a really loving family. And they were very well off. They did nicely because his parents owned a grocery store in town, a wholesale fruit and vegetable business. And, they were very wealthy. People knew them in town. They would come in and get, fruits and vegetables. And, my grandpa told me at one point that if people at school couldn't afford fruits and vegetables, his father was very generous. He would give kids who couldn't afford, meals, free fruits and vegetables. So they were a generous, loving, amazing family. And my grandpa would always tear up when he talked about his siblings and his parents because they just really loved each other so much. And life was pretty much normal. Until, of course, 1939, which was the start of World War II. And my grandpa at the time, and I tell the students this to keep this in mind, that the photos I shared with you were my grandpa as I knew him. And I'm sure you all can imagine your own grandparent and the things you loved about them. But just remember that the story actually takes place when he was only 13 and a half years of age. So the students are always shocked by this because most of the students that I speak to are in middle school or high school, and that's close to their age. And I tell them, you need to put yourself into his shoes, that this was their age when he went through this story, which to me, as I share it, will make it even more incredible that he survived at a young age of 13 and a half. When the war started and the Nazis arrived, my grandpa said that they did not have time to escape or even talk about escaping because, again, the Nazis were able to invade his town pretty early in the war. And he said for about 8 months, it started slow. The Nazis took over businesses, they burned down the synagogues, but nobody was taken to a concentration camp for a couple months because it was just them essentially taking over the town of Bendzin. My grandpa said that for the first 8 months, his father actually paid off the Nazis to leave them alone. And that every time the Nazis would come by their house, they would hide down in the cellar so that they were not, near them or seen. And that worked for a while until about 8 months in, the Nazis were searching for men from the ages of 13 to 60. And I always pause at this point and ask the students, why do you think they would be looking for men of that age? And I'm sure most of you know, because you have, maybe studied this, but the reason they were looking for men of that age was in the beginning, they needed them for labor. And my grandfather's father, Menzel, knew this, and he tried to actually keep my grandfather, Oscar or Usher at the time, from being taken, but the Nazis actually took him. So my grandfather, unfortunately, was the oldest of 4 brothers, and they took only him. So he, at the age of 13 and a half, was separated from his parents and his 3 younger brothers, and was also separated from his father as well. He was taken on a train to the first concentration camp. And if in his memory, he describes the first concentration camp as Gross Rosen. And when he got to the concentration camp, he had told me that they get a card. And this card is kind of like your punch card. They make you sign it. They give you your number, and they kind of write your job and your birth date and all the things about you. Because the Nazis were very proud of what they were doing, they kept meticulous records. And this was my grandfather's card, and his number was 128187. That's the name they called him. He was not called Usher anymore. He was known as his number, because the Nazis truly believed that Jews were animals and they were not, unique, and that everybody was called a number, because to them, they were a number. Other than getting a number, they shaved his head, because they said that they thought they had disease and they didn't want them to look any different from each other. So again, at the age of 13 and a half, he's alone. He has his head shaved. They gave him thin pajamas, and he told me in the beginning, they fed them water and cabbage, which was essentially what they called cabbage soup. They also gave them stale pieces of bread sometimes, but they were barely eating. My grandfather actually had 2 pieces of luck in the first part of this camp. The first piece of luck was that, other than all of these people that he didn't know that were strangers, he did have his best friend Mutik in the camp with him. And he told me that that was a true miracle, because he was alone at the age of 13, scared out of his mind without his family, but that he had a piece of home because he had his best friend Mutik. Something else that was lucky was that my grandfather actually looked at the Nazis that were in charge, and some of them were capos. And one of them was Capo Abusman, and my grandfather actually knew him from Bendzin. So the capo approached my grandfather and said, "I can't save you, but I can give you an easier job." And I explained to the students that that was lucky, because imagine not eating, only eating water and cabbage, and having to lift bricks or lift cement. And because he had an easier job, he was able to save his strength. He said this first camp, all he can really remember was being so hungry. And it was the first time he saw death. And it was, in the beginning, very shocking, because, again, he's 13 and a half. He's never seen anybody die. But he did say towards the end of this camp, death became the norm. He described at one moment that a man from his hometown was just working, and the Nazis told him to run. And they took a gun and just shot him straight in the head. And the man fell to the ground, and my grandfather was told that him and Mutik had to carry the dead body over to the crematorium. And again, at the age of 13 and a half, it's just unimaginable that that is something that one would have to go through. And I asked him, "What made you survive?" And he said, "All I kept thinking about was being able to see my mom," that he wanted to see his mom again and see his brothers and his father, but really his mom. And so for about a year, my grandfather was in this concentration camp, surviving with an easier job and, stale pieces of bread when he could find it. And then they transferred him and Mutik together to 2 more camps. One camp was called Machstadt, and the other camp was called Breslau-Neukirch. Those 2 camps, when I asked my grandfather about it at the age of 87, he said he doesn't really remember much. And I didn't want to push him too much, because he was already telling us some tragic, horrible details. And he said, "I just went to those camps. I spent a few months in each one, and I barely remember." But he did tell me that he remembered the 4th camp. He remembered this camp because it was the worst out of all of the camps that he went to. And this camp was called Finteichen. He told me at this camp, all of the Nazis were all Black. And there were rumors that if you found Nazis that were in all black, those were the death Nazis. And we know now from history that those were the highest ranking Nazis. And their goal was to exterminate as many Jews as possible. He said the sky was always filled with gray smoke from the crematorium, and it smelled like death. I just want to take us out of the story for a second just to kind of tell you timeline. According to my research, this would be about 3 years into his experience. So he's been in concentration camps for 3 years at this point, and somehow have survived. And now he was on the brink of death. At this camp, the Nazis were particularly cruel, and they were playing sick games with the prisoners. So during the day, they would make the prisoners walk back and forth from one side of the camp to the other for no reason at all. And they would take prisoners out of line and they would shoot them if they didn't walk correctly. At night, they would have the prisoners line up. And if they called your number, you were taken away. And the rumor was you were taken straight to the gas chambers. And so every night, my grandfather's heart would be beating out of his chest because he wasn't sure if his number was going to get called. And one night, unfortunately, Mutik's number was called. So my grandfather's best friend, who he'd been together with for 3 years, by some sort of miracle that they were even together at that point, was taken from him. And I asked him, what made you survive at that point? And he said, what was I going to say? If I spoke out against them and, begged them not to take my friend, they would have shot me too. And my heart breaks for him because it must have been a very sad and lonely experience. And then to have your friend taken away is unimaginable. And so my grandfather continued to work, continued to play these sick games. But one day they were walking back and forth across the camp, and my grandfather did not walk correctly. But instead of shooting him, they took him out of line and they took his arm and they snapped it in half. And they basically made an example out of him to show how weak Jews were. And they took him to the infirmary. On your screen there's the actual infirmary card that was all the illnesses that my grandfather was suffering from. In German, it says not only does he have a broken arm, but he also has pneumonia. So he was laying on the floor, waiting to die, weak, broken arm, barely able to breathe. And a doctor by the name of Dr. Zabrania walked over to him and in Polish whispered, "Are you Mendel Cukierman's son?" And my grandfather said yes. And he said, "Before the war, your mother was sick and your father brought me fruits and vegetables every single day. And because your father was kind to me, I'm going to save you." So the doctor took my grandfather into his office and he said, "I need you to be quiet. I'm going to try to save you and take care of you, but they cannot catch you." And he went around and told all the capos what was going on and said, "Please do not check my office and do not tell the head Nazis, but I'm going to try to save him because, his father was kind to me." And so the doctor brought my grandfather milk and rice and healed his arm as best he could. To the day my grandfather passed at the age of 90, his arm never fully healed. He had pain every single day, and he had a horrible cough that followed him the rest of his life because of how sick he was. But this doctor was so kind to him. And just a side note, this doctor was not a nice person. After the war, my grandfather said that he was actually found guilty and hung for war crimes. But the fact that he decided to help my grandfather is a true miracle. After the doctor fed my grandfather milk and rice and healed his arm for about 10 days, he snuck my grandpa out back into the camp and nobody knew. Within that week, my grandfather got onto a cattle car train to go to the 5th camp that he was being sent to. And if you look at the screen, I explained to the students that one car would fit 100 prisoners. They would stack them in like cattle, barely with any breathing room, no room to sit. And those cars on average would have 50 cars. So if you do the math, 50 times 100 is 5,000. So they would pack 5,000 prisoners onto one train. And my grandfather said through the window, he saw the sun rise 6 times. So he was on this train for 6 days with no food, no water. And I asked him, what got you through that? And he said, "I think the milk and rice probably saved me, but it was what gave him nightmares later on in life because people were dying all around him. Children were screaming, babies were crying, and the Nazis did not care. They just kept going." And at the end of the 6-day train ride, out of the 5,000 people on the train, only 11 people got off the train, and my grandfather was one of them. He said when he got off the train, he was barely alive, and he doesn't know how he made it, but it was a true miracle. In 1945, my grandfather arrived at Buchenwald concentration camp, which is, as most of you know, or if you don't, one of the more famous concentration camps. And at this concentration camp, they had captured Russian POWs. And so my grandfather, being taken off this train, was thrown into the same barrack as the Russian POWs. And lucky for him, the Russian POWs hadn't been there long. So they were a bit stronger and actually helped sneak my grandfather food and help him recover and be a little bit stronger. But my grandpa said at this camp, it was different because the Nazis seemed panicked. They were killing hundreds of thousands of Jews by the day. And later we found out it's because they were losing the war. After a couple months of barely surviving in this camp, the sirens started to blare and they told the prisoners they needed to exit the camp. So my grandfather, along with hundreds of prisoners, left out of Buchenwald. And the Nazis said, we're going into the Blue Forest and all you Jews better run. So they started to run, or as barely run, as my grandpa would say, because they couldn't really walk very far. And the Nazis would just start shooting. And so it was, my grandpa said, it's almost like a video game where you were dodging in between all these trees, trying not to get shot. And then all of a sudden, they heard explosions and a lot of gunfighting. And my grandpa crouched on the ground. And when he woke up, it was eerily silent. And he didn't know what to do. But in the distance, they saw trucks coming at them and strange men with strange accents throwing them chocolate bars. And they ran to them and said, please save us, save us. And they said, don't touch me, but here's chocolate. And they left. Later, we have done research, and those were the Americans. The Americans were very involved with fighting the Germans and the Axis powers, but they did not help really much with helping the prisoners rehabilitate because they felt like the prisoners had diseases. Luckily, my grandpa did not eat the chocolate because many prisoners did eat the chocolate and their stomachs actually exploded and they died. My grandpa said he didn't trust the chocolate, so he didn't eat it. But he didn't know what to do, so he sat there and he waited and waited because he didn't even know where he was. And the next day, a new group of soldiers came and they sounded more like him, and they were the Russians. And the Russians did scoop up the prisoners they could find, and they fed them back to health using a baby medicine dropper at first and slowly fed them more and more. My grandfather loved the Russians. He joined the Russian army and actually helped them fight Nazis towards the end of the war. He described the Russians very fondly. They taught him how to drink vodka, and he was an avid vodka drinker. And it was a time where he said he sought revenge. He was able to fight Nazis, but he knew in his heart that he needed to go home. So at the age of 18, 5 years later, he made his way home back to Bendzin and knocked on his door. Nobody answered. And this was not uncommon because people were separated all over Europe or all over the world. So he started to go around town and he found someone who used to work for the grocery store. And he asked them, he said, what happened to my father? What happened to my mother? What happened to Mutik and Wolf and Shia? And the man said, your father and I went to the same concentration camp. They beat him till he was almost dead, and then they buried him alive. So at the age of 18, my grandfather realized that his father had been murdered in a most brutal way. And he said his heart almost stopped because he cannot believe after 5 years of surviving literal hell that he lost his father in such a terrible way. And he said, well, what about my mother and 3 brothers? And the man said, I know that they were sent to Auschwitz. And so my grandfather collapsed to his knees and he could not fathom the fact that he probably had lost his mother and 3 brothers. And he would say, how could they do this? They were 10, they were, I'm gonna cry. They were 10, they were 6, they were 3. How could they do this? And I have sons of my own upstairs, and this part always gets me because it's just unimaginable evil. But my grandfather said he couldn't stay. So he ran to the local Jewish organization and said, I need to get out of here. Where can I go? I want to go to Israel. And they said, we're not going to send you to Israel because if you go to Israel, they're going to make you fight in the IDF. or the army at the time, and we don't want you to have to do that. But we will send you to Italy because a group of Bendzin members have moved there, and we think that you could find new community. So my grandfather traveled to Italy and lived in Milan, Italy for 5 years. And he said the Italian people were his favorite. They taught him how to eat pasta. He found a family that kind of took him in as a son, named their Raditoris, and they were so sweet and kind to him. And he said that Italian people really brought him out of a dark place. And he joined a soccer team with a bunch of his friends, and he tried to live a life that was worth living. And he changed his name to Oswaldo for a fresh start. And one day when he was playing soccer with his buddies, a scout actually found the soccer team and they thought he was pretty decent. So they asked him to join a professional soccer team called Inter Milan, which if you're a soccer fan, this is still a famous soccer team for today. And he played right wing. He was number 13 and he traveled the world with these soccer players and tried to start fresh. And he was living an amazing life in Italy until he found a letter that had come to him from America. And the letter was from his aunt, his father's sister, and she was alive. And it said she was living in Brooklyn, New York. So my grandfather had a tough decision. Does he stay and play soccer, and live this amazing life? Or does he go to America to find the only family that he knows? And so he decided to go to America. So this picture on the left here is his passport. It's the earliest photo my family has of him because every other photo was destroyed by the Nazis. We do not know what Mendel, Sirla, Wolf, Shia, or Mutik look like, other than what my grandfather described them as. And so this photo is pretty precious for us because, again, it's the youngest photo we have. And he hopped, on a boat to America in 1951. And when he got off the boat, he was walking down Delancey Street in Brooklyn, trying to find his aunt's apartment. And he decided to be called Oscar. He was going to start fresh in America with his family. He was really excited to see his aunt and reunite. And all of a sudden on Delancey Street, a car stopped. And someone hopped out of the car and yelled, "Usher." And he stopped and he took a moment. He said, because he wasn't sure who was calling him that, right? It was somebody from Poland. Could it have been someone like a Nazi or somebody not, safe? But he turned around, and to his total shock and amazement, it was his best friend, Mutik. Mutik was saved by Russians as well and moved to America earlier than my grandfather. And on my grandfather's first day in America, this is a true story, he ran into Mutik. And we call that in our culture, beshert. It was meant to be. And so my grandfather made it to his aunt's apartment and she said, "I got you set up in an apartment." And the funny thing was, Mutik was his neighbor. And my grandfather on the picture on the right, that is his wedding. And Mutik is in this photo as well. This is Mutik, and he was his best man. And they stayed best friends forever until, they both passed. And my grandpa started a brand new life with my grandmother. My grandmother, Elaine, was the love of his life. He called her his trophy, and she was his everything because he lost his entire family. And so they started a beautiful life together and had my father, Mark, and my Aunt Cheryl, who had me, my sister, Matthew, and Brooke. And we were a very close family and still are today. And we honor my Grandpa Oscar, who is actually turning 100 this year. So we'll be throwing him a large party. But now that I have explained a lot of his story of resilience, I'm going to go back to these photos. And now in the chat, I would like you to share, now what do you see? I'm going to share some of the answers. Pride, strength, triumph, survival, miracle. And I ask the students these questions and, they'll share some things. I'm just going to tell you kind of what they say. The first photo, they say, well, he obviously is so proud to see you graduate because he never graduated, right? And so education was so important to him. And that I shared family photos because family was so important. And I shared the photo of them wearing an American hat because he loved America. He was so proud to be an American. It was just such a wonderful place for him, a place where he could be free. And so whenever I speak to students, I ask them, why does this matter for you, right? What lessons can you learn from this story? And I want you to take a moment and think to yourself, I know this happened 80, 85 years ago, but really, what is it in your life that you take away from this personally? And I can share mine with you is that I definitely appreciate life more based on his story. I mean, my husband hates when I do this, but if we're having a hard day or complaining about something, I literally say, like, Grandpa Oscar, right? It puts things into perspective. And also resilience. My grandfather always told my sister and I, my cousins, you know, Cheryl and my dad, he would say, we have the blood of survivors. You can survive anything. And I asked my grandpa, what would you tell students? Like, what would you want them to get out of your story? And I want to play the video for you now.
To be very nice to each other and be good Americans, because America has to be the greatest country on earth.
And would you tell them to not discriminate against anybody?
Absolutely not to discriminate to anybody, because it is a very bad thing to do it.
Okay, can you say bye to the sixth graders and say thank you very much?
Okay, bye bye. Has been nice over here. God bless you all, and God bless the United States of America.
Thank you. And so you can hear in his voice, I mean, this was an hour after he gave in the most insane, tragic story of his life, and he would still joke and be happy. And I always end this way with my presentation. The students normally give me a standing ovation because they just love my grandfather. And I've had students come actually up to me, you know, afterwards, or even contact me years later and say, I still think about Grandpa Oscar. He changed my life. And I'm hoping after hearing his story, he's also changed yours. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say or ask any questions.
Wow, Wendy, thank you so much for gifting us with your family story. That was an incredible story. I feel like I know Oscar. We're now going to open it up for questions. As a reminder, if you have a question for Wendy, you can just type it into the Q&A and we'll do our best to address it. But if we don't get to your question, you can email it to events, events, at 3gnewyork.org, and we'll get back to you later on.
Hey, so first question I'd like to ask is, what are you hoping to achieve by sharing your grandfather's story?
Thank you for asking that question. Oh, that's that I could go on forever with that question, but I just, first of all, I hope to share his story because I think far too often we focus on history books or what they tell us on the news, or what lessons we've learned in school. But I think sharing true human stories is what builds empathy, and just that we are a proud and resilient people, and this should never happen again. And I think people hearing Oscar's story really does change people's lives. And so I think that's my main goal, is to just change lives.
Thank you. We have somebody who asked, learning the stories of your grandfather's experiences, did your parents talk about how it impacted their relationship with him? And do you feel like there was a burden of expectations placed on you as the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor?
That's a great question. I can't speak for, I mean, I know my dad and my aunt are on, and I know that they have experienced different level of trauma than I did as a 3G. And I know that, growing up, they always told us how important it was to be proud to be Jewish, right? And to celebrate the holidays and to find a Jewish community. And I think that's a sort of, I guess, pressure in a sense that I felt, is to always, be proud to be Jewish. And I never tucked this in, right? I always wear it with pride. And I think just in today's world, especially, just always showing that pride and being loud and proud is hard, but I like to do it. So
Here's another one from the audience. It's surprising that you didn't know he was a survivor until much later in your life. Why do you think it was never discussed before you were in middle school?
I think my grandpa tried to shield us from it as much as possible because he treated us like precious princesses, and he was such a happy-go-lucky guy. I mean, I knew that he didn't have parents or he didn't have siblings. And I think I knew that his life was different, like I kind of explained in the beginning, but I was also a very sensitive kid. So I think maybe my parents might have shielded me a bit, but I think once I found out, I mean, my aunt calls me the family historian. So I've done so much research and looked into it. So I've gone I'm the oldest grandchild. So I went full force into it, but I think that's why.
That resonates with me. So we have an audience member who asks if students ever ask you question regarding the state of anti-Semitism in America, since your grandfather was such a strong patriot.
Oh, if they ever ask about it. I have to tell you that maybe out of the hundreds of schools I've spoken in, I've maybe only had that question twice. And I do talk about it, but I kind of flip it on them. And that's part of my presentation that you don't get to see now. But at the end, I inspired them to act and to become allies of the Jewish community and to stand up for hatred. And we talk about ways to do that. Because, you know, I explained to them, knowing his story alone, you're bearing witness. And now you can tell someone if they deny the Holocaust or they say they hate Jews, like, no, I know a real story of Oscar, and it just grows that way. So I explain how to stand up to anti-Semitism and to be an ally. And I think that's really super powerful.
Absolutely.
In what areas of Europe were these camps? I guess maybe to elaborate, like, is there like a distance of like how far he was traveling between all these camps?
I believe from my research that most of the camps were surrounding Gross Rosen. And then Buchenwald was a little bit farther because that was the 6-day train ride, but all within Poland and Germany.
Someone asked about how did your grandmother live with your grandfather's story? And did you learn, this is the second part of with the same person, did you ever learn how Motek survived?
Okay, so the first part of the question was, my grandmother was an absolute saint. She was the best human on the planet. Anybody knew her, you know, I'm sure in the chat people will sound off with this, but she was the most kind, gentle, empathetic human. He drove her crazy sometimes, and some of his issues, yeah, my sister just said a saint. And so my grandfather definitely drove her crazy a bit and, you know, had his issues, but she was very patient with him and loving. And she herself was somewhat of a survivor as well. She actually hid out in Siberia during the war. All 5 of her family members had to hide in one small room. Yeah, she was a lovely human. Yeah. So, and she was the best. And unfortunately, we lost her at a pretty young age. And so that totally tore up my grandfather as well, because she was everything to him. And then can you repeat the second question, just because I started
how did you ever learn the story of Motek's survival?
The only thing that I got from my grandfather was that after he was taken that night, when they called his number, he went to another camp and the Russians liberated him as well. But so my grandfather, although he went to Italy for 5 years, Mutek immediately came to America, which is why he was more established in America before him.
I'm curious about this one because my family has the same thing. Do you feel the same way about purchasing German products as your grandfather felt?
Okay, so a couple students actually have asked me this question, and same thing, do you hate Germans? Like, they asked me that. And so first of all, I do not hate Germans. My sister actually is married to a lovely man who's half German, and we love Rob. So shout out to Rob if you're listening. And we love German people. We have nothing against them. And if anything, I explain to the students that Germany takes this way more seriously than America, right? Like, hi Rob. Like they make their students study the Holocaust, visit the concentration camp. So Germany's doing the work, right? That we wish we could do here. As far as German products, I will not buy a German car. My husband is, you know, we were talking about getting like a luxury vehicle at one point. And I was like, it can't be German. Like I told him that. So I think that has stuck with me.
Someone asked, what was your grandfather's life like in America? What did he do for a living?
Oh, great question. So he was actually a wallpaper hanger and a painter, and which was really fun for my sister and I because we would literally say, "Grandpa, can you can you paint our room pink?" And we would leave to go to school, and then he would come home and our rooms would be like pink and purple, which was really fun. But growing up, he actually like in his career, he actually had a lot of famous clients, including Frank Sinatra's manager, and his main clientele, which if you ever watch the hour-long video, when I ask him about it, he shushes me, but his main clientele was the Italian mafia. So he knew all the big crime families and they loved him because he spoke Italian. And so he lived a very interesting life.
Did he continue playing soccer when he came to the States?
No, but we would play, in the backyard but he was actually also an excellent swimmer. So he taught us like how to swim in the ocean and that was like our fondest memories. But no, he didn't really play soccer in America.
Did Grandpa Oscar ever return to Poland to visit, or did anyone from your family go to visit?
So my grandfather never made it to Poland, and actually he never made it to Israel either. We did send him back to Italy when he was older with my grandmother on a trip. But he didn't, I don't think he had any interest in going back to Poland, but he did regret not being able to go to Israel. And I've definitely made it a point that at some point in my life when, maybe my kids are a little older, I will be going back to Poland and especially his hometown and visiting some of the concentration camps. That is on my list to do. So.
I think this one's in Chad's. Did Grandpa Oscar connect with other survivors through a synagogue or other Jewish organizations during his lifetime?
Okay, so for being the most social man on the planet and knowing 10 languages, and he would talk to literal strangers at restaurants, like he would turn around and start talking to the waiters in, Italian. He did not want to join the temple. He had a beautiful voice, and we tried to get him to join the temple choir. We tried to get him to join the synagogue. He would not do it, and my dad or my aunt maybe could chime in on as to 100% why, but it might just be because he didn't want to, relive that. And so he was very social, but he was also recluse in that way.
Someone would like to know at what point or how, and I would add, have you already shared your grandpa's story with your sons?
Thank you for asking. No, I've not shared it with them yet. One of them is 5 and the other one is 3.5. So they're a little young. But when we think they're ready, I would like to share it with them. But they do know all about Grandpa Oscar. They never met him, but we talk about him probably on a daily basis. We say yes, Carrie's in the chat. We said his name a lot. We talk about him. They watch videos so they know him. They think he lives in the clouds. So they talk to him too. And I think when they're ready, I will talk to them about it. But they do also know that I talk to schools. Oh yes, Jake does have his chin. Yeah. But they do know what I do. Like I say, oh, I'm going to a school. I'm talking about Grandpa Oscar today. So they do know that that's my job. So.
Here's another question about Germany. Have you ever visited Germany? If so, how did you feel during your visit and afterwards, considering, what you've learned from your grandfather and how he told you he'd be against buying stuff from Germany? And now we know that you're not buying a German car either.
I've never been, but it's on my list to go. And I would love to, although it would be very hard, I do want to visit some of the concentration camps, particularly Auschwitz, because most likely his mom and his 3 brothers were sent there. And I'd like to go there and say a prayer and do the thing he could never do, is kind of like put them to rest. So that's one of my goals.
How did your grandpa Oscar embody Judaism or embrace it or encourage your family to embrace it?
So my grandpa Oscar, although he was very proud to be Jewish and, they ate kosher in the house and, all of the things, he did not believe in God after the Holocaust. And my grandmother was very religious and she kept kosher and, we celebrated all the holidays, but he had a tough time with believing and having faith. But he did say how proud he was to be Jewish. And when I brought my husband home, nice Jewish boy from New Jersey, he was very happy because he was like, oh yeah, my Jewish girl. So that's, so both.
Um, let's see. I don't think we talked about this, but This is for the beginning. Our session started with the Frank Sinatra in the background, right? We didn't cover this. So can you tell us about your grandfather and Frank Sinatra?
Yes, so my grandfather loved Frank Sinatra. He actually went to a concert to listen to Frank Sinatra, and he sat next to his wife. And so he had like a whole story about how he chatted with her, and through that he made a connection. And actually, Frank Sinatra's manager was his client. So he loved Frank. He called him Frankie and would play him in the car. And I knew Frank Sinatra music when I was like 8, and I'd be singing it in school. And all my teachers thought it was so funny that I would sing all these songs like Fly Me to the Moon, which is what we played in the beginning, or My Way. He loved My Way.
And someone asked, how do you carry his trauma, if you carry his trauma?
I feel an immense amount of not pressure, but I feel like an immense duty to continue his story and to make sure people know about it. And I would say most currently, and I'm sure my 2G and 3Gs on the call would agree with me on this, but of course, every Jew is affected by what's going on in the world. But if you are a 2G or a 3G and have a descendant of a Holocaust survivor, it is affecting us at a deeper level. We've heard stories from our grandparents over the years of all this trauma and terrible things that could happen, and to see it happening in real life is very traumatic, and I am just devastated. But that's why we're doing what we're doing.
We have a lot more questions, but unfortunately we can't get to them tonight. So Wendy, thank you for speaking tonight and for sharing your grandfather's story. We're grateful to have you involved with 3GNY, and thank you to Amy for being an important part of this program. Thanks again to all of you in the audience for joining us. We're glad you took the time to hear Wendy speak words that must never be forgotten. If you haven't yet made a gift to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat for ways you can donate. Thank you. We also love your feedback about tonight's event. Check your email for a quick survey to help us learn from tonight's program to better serve the 3GNY community. Also, if you have connections with educators who may want our speakers to present to their classes, please let us know. We have a large speakers bureau of hundreds of grandchildren prepared and ready to present, just like you saw Wendy do tonight. We'll send out an email in the coming days with more information, as well as a recording of tonight's program. You can check out our past WEDU Wednesday speakers and other events on 3GNY's YouTube channel. Thanks again for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. We are grateful, as always, for your presence and support. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone, so much. And I hope you will never forget Grandpa Oscar.